If you'd like, you can go ahead and make your way over to Psalm 1. Psalm 1, we're going to be in Psalm 1, really verse 1 this morning, and then we'll move on into the rest of it in our second lesson of the morning. Have you ever been sitting and suddenly you've got a thought and you wonder, how is it that I'm thinking about this? And it may be that you are sitting there and suddenly you're thinking about the time you fell off your bicycle when you were 7 years old. And it's like, how did I get to this thought? Maybe that happens to us a lot when we're sitting in a doctor's waiting room or waiting for our oil to be changed or something like that. I'm sure it never happens to you in a sermon. Anytime, though, that you kind of let your mind go into neutral, you realize your mind is never in neutral. Really, when you don't have something you're concentrating on, it's like you throw the gate open and all of these different thoughts will start coming around. And a really interesting old mind game is to work your way back. How did I get here? How was it that this particular thought process occurred? And you can always figure it out if you have enough time. You can know that something triggered a thought that triggered another thought until ultimately you can work it back to its starting point. Oftentimes in our gotcha culture, we'll see someone on television who has been caught in some kind of scandal or something of that nature. And there's something pretty common about that. A lot of times the person will say, I don't know how I got here. But you don't have to listen to a celebrity for that. Sometimes even amongst our own brethren or likely even ourselves, we may get to a point where we have been involved in some kind of sin, and regardless of whether we're found out or not, we'll either publicly state or state to ourselves, I don't know how I got here. Well, that's really an untrue statement. Because if we think about it, we can always get back to the starting point. And that's because with sin, there is always a progression. There's always a starting point that gets us to where we do not want to be. And so as we look here in Psalm 1, we're going to find that really verse 1 is presented in a positive way. When the writer says, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. Well, while that's positive, that's the progression. It's showing us what's going to happen if we ever allow our guard to be let down. Psalm 1 is a tremendous psalm for a lot of reasons, but it's a gateway into the book of Psalms. It's very purposely placed there. Because Psalm 1 is showing us what's going to happen in these next 149 Psalms to come. But even more than that, really it's a life thing. It's showing us that the way we think, the way we act, who we associate with, all of that is going to get us in one direction or other. It's going to progress us in one direction or the other. So let's take a few minutes this morning to consider this, but I want to start out with a little bit more of an overview of this psalm, because throughout you've got a description of a wicked man, and he's described in several ways. First thing, he says, the writer says, that wicked man, verse 4, is like chaff that the wind drives away. I've had a number of occasions to visit an area of the world that's very agricultural. And I've noticed at certain times when I'm there, often you'll see a lady sitting out by her little house, and she'll be getting the chaff out of the grain, just like we used to do 100 years ago's everyday life there. And so you can watch, and as she throws it up in the air, you'll watch that chaff blow away for no good. It has no purpose. And so our writer says that's really what a wicked man is like. He's made such a mess out of things that he's going to be blown away like that chaff. And the psalmist continues, and in verse 5, kind of a double part with the same message. He says, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. Doesn't mean he's not going to be brought to judgment. It means when he's brought to judgment, he's got no standing. There's nothing there that's going to help him one way or the other. And the same thing is true in the congregation of the righteous. He has no stay there. And so the writer then kind of finishes this thought out in verse 6 when he says, the way of the wicked will perish. Now we look at that, and I'm convinced that because we're here this morning, we're interested in godly things. God says, if you turn away from me, this is what it's like. Now how does that happen? Well, he says you're blessed if you don't progress in that direction. So as we look at verse 1, and he talks about really the first step. He says, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly. Walking is a huge Bible theme. You ever notice that? You got people walking all the way through. You remember where it starts? It's in Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve have committed a sin, and the text tells us that they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden. I don't know how long it was between their creation and that first sin, but this sure seems to indicate that there was a routine, that God would come into their presence. And if we use our imagination a bit, we could think about how that this would be a teaching session. So you've got Adam and Eve looking forward to the Lord's coming, and as He comes, He's telling them, He's teaching them the knowledge of good and evil. They don't need to shortcut. God's providing that for them. And so here is this first walk, and what a tremendous walking companion that is. And the New Testament will flesh all that out as we think about our walk with God. But our writer here shows us the direction that Adam and Eve went. Rather than taking advantage of this walking with God, instead they chose to walk with evil companions. And that same danger is so true for us. Now, we could go in a lot of different directions with this point. I'm going to kind of keep it to a minimum this morning, but I want to mention a few things to you that I think are really dangerous for us right now. That as we think about being Christians in the 21st century, I mean, we're not unique in that these things are a temptation, but they seem to be particularly pressing at the moment. And one of those is when we choose angry, bitter, kind of this group of people with this retaliatory spirit. If we choose them as our walking companions, people we listen to, people we spend time with, that's a grave danger for us. And so why do I choose that for this particular moment in time? Well, let's listen to the book of Proverbs. In fact, for the rest of our time, we're going to be kind of toggling between the book of Proverbs and Matthew chapter 5. If you want to go ahead and hold your thumb at Matthew 5, we'll be over there in a minute. But let me explain why I'm doing that. The book of Proverbs really is like that walking time with God. It's a book that's showing us what it would sound like to Adam and Eve if they were walking in the garden with God. And He's teaching them the difference between good and evil. And He says something like, now, there are going to be angry people that come around. Don't make a friendship with them. Don't have friendship with a wrathful man. And so we look at that and we understand the warning that's given there. And as we look over to Matthew chapter 5, this is somewhat like a Proverbs in miniature, as the Lord is giving this powerful Sermon on the Mount, the foundation stone of His coming kingdom, and He's telling us how to walk with God. Well, He shows us, again, that same language about the danger of walking with someone who's angry, of allowing ourselves to become that kind of person. If you look in verse 22, He says, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. I had this ground into me as a child, you don't ever call anybody a fool. I'm glad that's the case. That's just not part of my vocabulary. But I'm afraid that many of us may have got the point, don't use that word, and we almost have the attitude, I won't call those idiots fools no matter what they do, right? Well, the principle that God is saying is when you call someone a fool, it's saying something about your attitude toward them. That word fool is to take away their humanness. In this particular setting, it's to look at someone and say, I don't even value you as a human being. You're not even on that plane with me. And he says, if you ever get to a point where you're calling someone this name that's indicating an attitude that you care nothing about them, you have no respect whatsoever, even for the fact that they're created in the image of God, you're in trouble. So how is it that we get to that point? It's our walking companions. It's who I choose as my counselors. Now, you may be thinking, oh, all my friends are peaceful people. They're not bitter people. Well, you can walk with someone without being on the same path, literally, with them. Now, particularly for our culture, we are in a moment that is one of the most divided politically that the nation has ever known. Now, politics is always dirty, right? There's rarely a time when that's not the case. But there is a divisiveness now that maybe has been unseen in 100, 150 years. And it seems like that you've got people who are so given to their particular attitudes that they look across the aisle and they say, I don't even recognize these people as being fellow human. You ever heard any language like that? That's dangerous. And so if I'm spending my day listening to this kind of thing, don't be surprised when it progresses. I hear of people who get up in the morning and they turn on one of these news stations and leave it on the entire day. And so for 12 hours, you got the background music of two people who are arguing with each other. What's that going to do to us? Or we get in the car and all of our free time is spent consuming this kind of vitriol. Well, there's a danger there. And I think Christians have to be very careful of it. Now, that may sound kind of strange from a guy who taught government for 33 years, right? But nonetheless, we got to realize that when we talk about Christianity, we're keeping our mind pure. We're focusing on those things that are good and right. And we think about the avenue of social media, what that's done. The anger, the vitriol, the bitterness, when you scroll down through these posts that people are making and they're so upset about everything from a pothole in the road to a bomb in Iraq. And it's just these terrible things that they're saying about others. Or maybe it is people on your same path. Maybe it's people you work with. Sometimes you can't help that, but you can help being an associate in that kind of talk. Now, all of that is simply to say that if I am choosing this kind of counselor, I'm in trouble. But let's not stop quite there yet. There is very grave danger amongst our Christian brethren in this. Someone gets bitter over things. And every conversation is about the church going in the wrong direction, and I don't know what this church is coming to. As I heard a guy say, well, I probably in a few years there won't be any faithful churches in this area. You really want that person as your counselor? No. So we must be very careful about that kind of thing. Now, let me share another one that I think is a very dangerous thing, and that's the lustful. Again, let's follow our progress. If we were walking with God in the garden, He might tell us a story. He said, now, let me just give you this little parable. There was this man and a woman came out to meet him, and she was dressed as a prostitute, and she was wily of heart, and she kissed him. She said, my husband's away on a trip, and I got the house all ready. All right, that's a danger, isn't it? That's a bad walking companion. But then the text goes on in this parable, and it says, let me tell you what happened. This guy, all at once, he follows her, goes in her direction, as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a stag is caught fast. The Lord would say to us, there's a progression here. If you're still here in Matthew chapter 5, verse 28, I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That's strong language. But he's saying if you let your mind dwell on these things, if you have the lustful as your walking companion, don't be shocked when it leads to an unfaithful marriage, when it leads to a relationship of fornication. Don't be surprised by that. Do we have lustful counselors? What an epidemic we live in of pornography. It's always been a problem. I mean, you can go all the way back even thousands of years ago and see that. But in this particular moment in time, it is easier to get and more private than it's ever been before. You start looking at the statistics and you see it's epidemic in young men, and I think young women are kind of catching up. And there will be polls and surveys done, and young men and women who are considering themselves Christians report very similar statistics to those who are not. Why? It's addictive. Am I walking with those people who put those images on some website? Am I walking with those sites that have the videos and I'm looking at these things and watching them? Have I got friends who are encouraging me to look? Do I enjoy being around people who joke like they're in a boys' locker room? That kind of language. Am I with people who are just sexually impure and make no excuse for it? It's just a way of life. Well, as a Christian, I don't want to separate myself from people like that. I want to be a good influence. But if I am allowing myself to be influenced by that, there's very grave danger. The lustful are not very good walking companions. Let me just give you one other to think about. And that's people who are just dishonest. Again, what if the Lord were speaking to us and we're there in that garden walk and He says, let me tell you, a dishonest man, he's going to mess things up. He's going to spread strife, and someone who's spreading that strife and gossiping behind people's backs is going to separate close friends. Jesus says there's a progression. You look down to verses 33 through 37, and this is something just on honesty. And he says, look, you don't even need to take an oath at all. And he gives all these different things. And we drop down to verse 37, and he says, let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. If I'm the kind of person, and I know we get in the habit of this, so I'm not trying to be condemning in this, but if I become the kind of person who's always got to say, I'm going to do this, I promise. I promise you I'm going to do it. I may need to take a little closer look here. I need to be the kind of person that when I tell someone something, it's true. That person can take it to the bank, it's believable. That's who God wants me to be. So, what kind of walking companions are going to get me into trouble? I want to talk to our younger members here for just a minute. I think maybe our junior high school in here, probably some college age. Those who encourage you to cheat are not good walking companions. In our particular moment, the reason I picked these out is because, again, cheating is easier than it's ever been. I mean, you've got artificial intelligence that'll give you the answer to most any question you want to ask it. You've got all kinds of apps and such that provide instantaneous, that if you can just keep your phone or whatever device you've got hidden from the teacher, professor, don't walk with that kind of people. That is training you to have a mind that does not respect honesty. And if you look again at the statistics, you'll find that most college age and younger really don't see much problem with it. There's a danger, but it doesn't go away. Maybe this time of year we think about those who may try to do their taxes in a way to defraud the government. It's easy to do, isn't it? Just slip something in. Or someone who's just willing to lie. All of these are examples of that dangerous walking companion that we're talking about. But as we consider that, let's go ahead now and think about our next stage. So we're walking with those who are dangerous. We've seen that progression, and it progresses to standing. You're no longer walking, now you're standing in the way of sinners. What does that mean for us? All those points that we just talked about. When I choose the wrong walking companions, when I'm constantly allowing my mind to absorb and to feed on that kind of thing, that's going to change me. I may not think it will, but it will. It's going to change me, and it's going to influence me in such a way that my thinking is turning away from the things of God and turning toward things that are totally ungodly. So blessed is the man who does not stand in the way of sinners. The man who stands in the way of sinners, he's going to be like the chaff. He's going to be the one who can't stand in the judgment. I think about what Paul wrote to the Corinthians. Familiar verse. Probably those of us who grew up in Christian homes have had this memorized a long time. What we might not know is that it was written to Christians about Christians. But the principle is still the same. Don't be deceived. Bad company is going to corrupt or it's going to ruin your good morals. The things you know that are right, if you're hanging around and walking with people who don't believe those things, it's going to lead you astray. Well, once again, let's listen to what the writer of Proverbs is going to tell us. This idea of being led astray, chapter 12, verse 26, on our imaginary walk with God here in the garden, he says, now, one who is righteous, that's who you want to find. He's a guide. He's going to help his neighbor. But the way of the wicked is the one that's going to lead them astray. So what does that mean for me? Is that God's view is no longer considered the right way. That's where I come. That's where I progress. And so that man or that lady who says, I just don't know how I got in this situation. Well, we're figuring it out. You walked, and now you're standing with the counsel of those who really are not given to the ways of godliness. Think about how that takes place. We live in this cultural moment that if you had ever 30 years ago tried to imagine where we are right now, I think it would have been beyond the imagination. Where we're having such problems with gender and sexuality and all of these different things. And if you don't accept that, you're really viewed as kind of backward. Now, I don't know, the pendulum may be swinging back the other way a bit at the moment. We're hearing some people kind of standing up to that publicly, and perhaps that's our answered prayers on that topic. But nonetheless, still very prevalent. And it may be that you are in a work environment or a school environment that even to cast any kind of doubt on that might just cost you your job. Or it might land you in the principal's office or in some college official's office to explain yourself. That's where we are. And if I've allowed myself to walk in that frame of mind, I don't need to be surprised when I start thinking, maybe I could be a little more open-minded. Maybe that narrow-minded church of mine or those narrow-minded parents of mine, they just didn't really get it. I think it can also happen to us religiously. I hear the word tradition used a lot now with different backgrounds. I came from this religious tradition. Now understand there's a place for that. But it's almost like you're saying that in this religious marketplace, everybody sets their own little stand up with traditions, and we are not exempt from that. And we start thinking, okay, well, if I'm going to be accepting and open-minded, I'm going to accept everyone's traditions. Well, I got to look at myself first of all. And I got to say, am I following God's plan? Not some plan that's been passed down to me through the years. Am I standing with God, or Am I standing in this marketplace of ideas and just tossed like the wave of the sea between one and the other? That happens when I no longer view God's way as the right way. And then it's almost as if we come full circle. Because after walking with the ungodly and standing in the way of sinners, we find ourselves sitting in the seat of the scoffer. And it is here the book of Proverbs just lights up. I want you to consider all the different ways that this is used in the book of Proverbs. And I've just got a sampling here. Chapter 9, verses 7 and 8, whoever corrects a scoffer gets himself abuse. The scoffer is opposed to the truth. This is one who you're trying to tell what's right and that there's a standard. And God says, don't be surprised when he turns on you. You ever had that happen? Trying to correct, doing it hopefully in a very nice, calm, Christian-like way, but you just get the vitriol of someone poured back on you. God says, don't be surprised by that. We think about chapter 13, verse 1. A wise son hears his father's instructions, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. He says the one who is a scoffer has so closed his ears to what's right that he's not even going to listen to the one who he should respect the most as that source of wisdom on earth, that being a godly father, godly mother. We think about chapter 21, verse 24. Scoffer is the name of the arrogant, haughty man who acts with arrogant pride. We also think about chapter 29, verse 8. Scoffers set the city aflame, but the wise turn away wrath. So he's a troublemaker. Now, you look at this, and here is this book that is giving us the wisdom of God as though we're walking with him on the path. And he's saying, don't walk with the scoffer, but he's also saying to us, don't be that scoffer. So many times, if we are not awfully careful, we'll hear messages like this and we'll think about everybody who fits that category before we start looking inward and say, am I opposed? When someone comes to me with the truth, am I arrogant toward that? I refuse to listen. I'm that troublemaker. And that's what a scoffer does. But God says, if you walk in the way of the ungodly and you stand in the way of the sinner, don't be surprised that you are now seated with that scoffer. I take my place in the assembly. I don't know if this is a point or just interesting, but I'm going to tell you anyway. When you look back to the original language, the same word translated scoffer is also translated ambassador. I think it's probably a little bit more than an interesting thought, don't you? An ambassador is who takes our country to someone else. And so as the writer talks here about scoffing, and you're sitting with the scoffers, it's as if you now, after walking and after standing, you now have become the wicked counselor. You're now that one that may tempt someone else in being that walking partner to discourage others with angry, bitter, retaliatory talk. We've got to listen to ourselves. We've got to hear what we're saying. Am I the one now who is the walking companion trying to corrupt someone's good morals? Am I the walking companion who's encouraging dishonesty? You see how that comes full circle? Once I was being led by a walking companion, now I am leading as that walking companion. So as we begin to wrap this up, we look to Psalm 1. We look to the book of Proverbs. We look to the Sermon on the Mount. And in all three of these places, God is saying to us, I'm trying to give you a message here of you don't want to end up in that place where you say, I don't know how any of this ever happened. So the message for us is, is to take heed. I think about what the apostle wrote in 1 Corinthians 10:12. As he's talking about Israel and what happened to them, he brought them out of Egypt, they passed through the Red Sea, baptized, so to speak, in his language. And then he says, you know what? They became idolaters. And they fell. So his point is, you need to take heed lest that happens to you. So let's make a very important point. Israel never started out to be idolaters and grumblers, did they? They didn't come out of the land of Egypt and said, oh, we're so excited, now we can start grumbling and we can start following idols. You look at what's happening when they walk out of Egypt, there's fear for sure. But nonetheless, they come out, and we're going to look at this a little bit later in the day, Lord willing. And they are singing a song of triumph, where it says, our Lord has sunk the enemies to the bottom of the sea. He's the one who saved us. They are people who are excited and enthused and godly. But it doesn't take long, does it? And when a few began to grumble and murmur, and a few began to cast these longing looks over to the pagans of the land, it's not long before they're leading others there, and it's not too long before the congregation pretty much as a whole is sitting in the seat of scoffers. And you can read the Old Testament account of God and His pleading, like this loving parent who's trying to bring a wayward child back to walk in His counsel. But isn't that exactly what we saw at the beginning? That Genesis 3 sin has just continued to be replicated time and time again, that you really can't trust God, that there's something better and you're missing out on it. And what worked in that garden sin has worked for all these years since with every human generation that's come along. And so God says, now it's time to stand up and to take heed. Don't let that happen to you. Don't walk with sinners. Don't stand in the way of sinners. Don't get into the counsel of sinners. You take heed to yourself. Now, here's the most dangerous statement we can make. We can say, that could never happen to me. I am a good, God-fearing, church-going Christian. That kind of thing can't happen to me. If you have that attitude, I can almost assure you it's not going to be too long before you're saying, how did this happen? It's understanding the warning that God has given, that any seed that we allow to be planted is going to have the potential to grow. And if I am walking in the counsel of angry politicians, if I am walking in the counsel of people who aren't very pure sexually, if I'm walking in the counsel of people who are dishonest, then I'm eventually going to stand with them. And I'm going to sit with them. And when that stops bothering me, that seed is going to begin to grow. And so then, we'll throw one more book here. We've been in 3. Let's think about James for a minute. He says, each person, when he is tempted, he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, it brings forth death. And that's what happens. And so then as we think about this, I've got to be taking the necessary action to grow into a tree of life, which we're going to talk about in our next hour. But as we conclude this particular part of our study, let's end with the words of Jesus. Hopping a few chapters over from chapter 5 to chapter 16, verse 24. Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross. I'll change it just a little. And walk with me. That's how we stay faithful. That's how we're blessed. If we say, I am not ashamed of Jesus Christ, I'm going to take up that cross, I'm going to walk lockstep with Him, that's how we keep from falling. And so I hope as we begin this study on Psalm 1 that we understand the danger and that we are doing what's necessary in our lives to make sure that we are continuing on that walk with our Lord. Now, in our next study, we're going to take it in a much more positive direction. We're going to look and see what happens when we're blessed, when we refuse to do that. And we're going to see then that the seed that's going to be planted is going to grow into a tree that will be our very lives. Thank you for your good attention this morning, and we'll look forward to joining back with Psalm 1 here in just a few minutes.